Chapter 8. Kristin stayed at home at Husaby this autumn and winter, and would go nowhere. She gave for a reason that she was ailing, but she was only tired. So tired she had never been before in her life. Tired of being merry, and tired of sorrowing, and tired, most of all, of brooding. It would be better when this new child had come, she thought. She longed much for it. It was as though it was to be the saving of her. If it were a son, and her father died before its birth, it should bear his name. And she thought how she would love this child and nurse it at her own breast. It was so long since she had nursed a child that she could weep with longing when she thought that now she should soon have a suckling in her arms again. She gathered her sons about her knee again, as she had been used to do in early days, and strove to make their upbringing somewhat more orderly and mannerly. She felt that in this she was obeying her father's wish, and this brought some peace into her soul. Sarah Eilif had begun now to teach Narkvi and Jorgulf their letters and the Latin tongue, and Kristin often sat over in the priest's house when the children were there at their book. But as scholars they showed not much thirst for knowledge, and all the children were wild and unruly, save Gout alone, so that he still was his mother's poppet, as Erland called it. Erland came back from Denmark about All Saints' Tide, in high feather. He had been entertained with the greatest honour by the Duke and his kinswoman Lady Ingeborg. They had thanked him right heartily for his gifts of silver and furs. He had ridden in the jousts and chased the hart and the hind. And when they parted, Sir Knut had bestowed on him a coal-black Spanish stallion, while the lady had sent loving greetings and 2 silver-grey greyhounds to his wife. Kristin thought that these outlandish hounds looked faithless and treacherous, and she was afraid they might do her children hurt. And the folk all through the countryside talked much of the Castilian steed. 'Twas true Erland looked well on the long-legged, light-built horse, but such beasts were unsuitable for this northern land, and God only knew how the stallion would get about on the hill paths. However it was, Erland brought up now, wherever he went about in his charge, the bravest black mares, till he had made him a stud that was fair to look on at the least. In other days Erland Nicolausen had used to give his riding horses fine outlandish names, Belcolor and Bayard and such like. But this horse, he said, was so rare a beast that he needed no such adornment. Plain Soten should be his name. Erland chafed much that his wife would not go about with him anywhere. Sick he could not mark that she was. She neither swooned away nor vomited this time. No sign was to be seen upon her yet, and most like her paleness and weariness were from evermore sitting indoors, brooding and pondering over his misdeeds. Yuletide came round, and hot quarrels arose between them. And now Erland no longer came afterward to beg forgiveness for his hot temper, as he had ever used to do before. Till now he had always thought, when there was strife between them, that 'twas he was at fault. Kristin was good, she was ever in the right, and if he wearied and was ill at ease in his home, it was but that his nature was such that he grew weary of what was good and right when he had too much of it. But last summer he had marked more than once that his father-in-law agreed with him, and seemed to think that Kristin was lacking in wifely gentleness and forbearance. And then it came into his thought that she took things to heart in a petty way, and was hardly brought to forgive him small misdeeds that had not been meant so ill on his part. Always had he prayed her for forgiveness when he had had time to think, and she had said that she forgave. But afterward he had been made to see that 'twas hidden away, but not forgotten. So he was much from home, and now he often took his daughter Margaret with him. The maid's upbringing had ever been one of the things that set them at odds. Kristin had never said anything of it, but Erland knew well what she and others thought. He had dealt with Margaret in all ways as she had been his true-born child, and folk made her welcome as though she were such when she went about with her father and stepmother. At Ramborg's wedding she had been one of the bridesmaids, and had borne a golden garland on her flowing hair. Many of the women liked this but ill, but Lavrans had talked them round, and Simon, too, had said that none must say anything against it to Erland, or speak of it to the maid herself. 'Twas not the fair child's fault that she was so luckless in her birth. But Kristin saw that Erland had planned to wed Margaret to an esquire bearing arms, and that he believed, with the standing he now had, he would be able to bring this about, although the maid was begotten in adultery, and 'twould be a hard matter to win for her a safe firm footing amongst good folk. It might perchance have been done if folk had felt any right faith that Erland had it in him to keep up and increase the might and riches in his house. But though Erland was liked and honoured after a fashion, 'twas as though no one had full faith that the fair fortunes of Husaby would endure. Thus Kristin feared he would be hard put to bring his plans for Margaret to a good end. And though she didn't like Margaret very much, yet she pitied the maid, and dreaded the day when, maybe, her pride must be broken, if she must be content with a much humbler match than her father had taught her to look for, and quite another way of life than the one he had nurtured her in. Thus things were, when, just after Candlemas, 3 men from Formo came to Husaby. They had come across the hills on ski in haste, bringing Erland letters from Simon Anderson. Simon wrote that their father-in-law had now fallen so sick that 'twas not to be looked for that he could live long, and that Lavrans had bade him pray that Erland would come to Sill if 'twere possible for him. He was fain to have speech with his 2 sons-in-law of how all things should be ordered when he was gone. Erland went about, casting stolen glances at his wife. She was far gone with child now, pale and thin-faced, and she looked so sorrowful. Every moment the tears would be welling up. He began to repent his behaviour to her in the winter. Her father's sickness had not come on her unlooked for, and if so it was that she had had to bear about this secret sorrow, he could better forgive her unreasonable ways. Alone he could have made the journey to Sill and back swiftly enough, going on ski across the mountains. But if he took his wife with him, 'twould be a slow and toilsome business. And then he would need to tarry until after the alms muster in Lent, and set trysts there with his sheriffs. And there were some meetings too that he must attend himself. Before they could set forth, 'twould be perilously near the time she looked to be delivered. And Kristin too, who could no wise endure the sea even when she was well. But he was loath to think of her not seeing her father before he died. In the evening, when they had lain down, he asked her if she dared make the journey. It seemed to him he was well repaid when she threw herself weeping in his arms, full of thankfulness and of penitence for her unfriendliness towards him in the winter. Erland grew soft and tender, as he ever was when he had brought grief to a woman and had to see her sorrow it out before his eyes. And he bore well enough afterward with Kristin's fantasies. He had said from the first the children he would not have with them. But the mother would have it that Nakvi was so great a boy now, 'twould be well for him to see his grandfathers going hence. Erland said no. Then she was sure that Ivar and Skule were too small to be left behind in the serving women's charge. "No," said their father. And then Lavrans had been so fond of gout. "No," said Erland. "'Twas hard enough as it was, things being as they were with her, for Ranfrey to have a childbirth in the house, while her husband lay on his sick bed, and for themselves on the journey homeward with the newborn babe. Either must she give the child out to nurse on one of Lavrans' farms, or she must tarry at Yorengard till 'twas summer, but then he must come home before her. He had to put all this to her over and over again, but he strove to speak calmly and reasonably. Then he bethought him that he should take from Nidaros one thing and another that his mother-in-law might need for the grave ale, wine and wax, wheat flour and millet and the like. But at length they were ready to set forth, and they came to Yorengard the day before Gertrude's Mass. But Kristin found 'twas far otherwise than she had thought to be at home at this time. She should have rejoiced with all her heart that it had been given her to see her father once again, and when she remembered his joy at her coming, and how he had thanked Erland for it, she was indeed glad. But she felt that she was shut out now from so much that passed, and this hurt her. It was but a short month before her time, and Lavrans utterly forbade that she should have the least hand in nursing or tending him. They would not let her watch by him at night in turn with the others, nor would her mother suffer her to move a finger towards helping in all the press of work. She sat by her father all day, but 'twas seldom that they were alone at any time. Almost daily there came guests to the house, friends come to see Lavrans Bjorgelsen once again in life. These visits pleased her father, though they made him exceeding weary. He talked heartily and cheerfully with all, men and women, rich and poor, young and old. He thanked them for their friendship, and asked their prayers for his soul. And God grant that we may meet on the day of bliss. At night, when only his own folk were with him, Kristin lay above in the upper hall staring into the dark, and could not sleep for thinking on her father's going, and on her own heart's folly and wickedness. Lavrans' end was swiftly drawing nigh. He had kept himself up and about till Ramborg had borne her child, and there was no more need for Ranfrey to be so much at Formo. He had had himself driven down there one day and seen his daughter and granddaughter. Ulfhild, the little maid, had been called. But after that he took to bed, and it was not likely he would ever rise again. He lay in the great room under the upper hall. They had made a kind of bed for him there on the bench of the high seat, for he could not endure to have his head pillowed high. When it was so, he grew dizzy at once and had swooning fits and heart spasms. They dared not let him blood any more. They had had to do it so often all through the autumn and winter that now he was quite drained of blood, and he could eat and drink but little. Her father's fine and comely features were sharp now, and the brownness was faded from his face that had weathered before to so fresh a hue. It was yellow now as bone, and the lips and corners of the eyes pale and bloodless. The thick hair, flaxen but powdered with white, lay unclipped, withered and strengthless over the blue patterned pillow cover. But what changed him most was the coarse grey stubble growing now on the lower face and on the long wide throat, where the sinews stood out like strong cords. Lavrans had always been so nice in shaving himself before each holy day. His body now was wasted till it was little more than a skeleton. But he said that he was easy so long as he lay stretched out and moved but little. And he was cheerful and glad at all times. They slaughtered and brewed and baked for the grave ale, had out bed gear for all the beds, and went through it with care. All that could be got out of hand now was done, so that all might be still and quiet when the last struggle came. It cheered Lavrans greatly to hear of all that was making ready. His last feast would not be the least of all the festivals that had been held at Jorengard. In honour and worship would he depart from the governance of his lands and his people. One day he had a mind to see the 2 cows that were to follow in his funeral train, as gifts for Sire Eirik and Sire Solmund, and they were led into the hall. They had been given double feed all the winter, and they were, in sooth, as fine and fat as satyr cattle at Olaf's Mass, though now it was the midst of the spring dearth. He was the one that laughed most when one of them dropped somewhat on the hall floor. But he was fearful that his wife would be altogether worn out. Kristin had thought she herself was a notable housewife. She had the name of one at home in Scone, but it seemed to her now that beside her mother she was nothing. No one could understand how Ranfrid was able to compass all she did, and yet she seemed never to be long away from her husband, and she took her share of watching every night. "Never trouble about me, husband," she said, laying her hand in his. "When you are dead, you know that I shall rest altogether from all such cares." Lavrans Bjorgelsen had bought him some years back a resting place in the church of the preaching friars at Hamar, and Ranfrid Ivarsdatter was set on going thither with his corpse and dwelling there near by it. She was to be a commoner in a hospice the monks owned in the town. But first the coffin was to be taken into the Olaf's church here at home, with great gifts to the church and the priests. His stallion was to be led after with his armour and weapons, and these were to be redeemed by Erland for 45 marks of silver. One of his and Kristin's sons would most like be given these things. For choice the child she was soon to bear, if 'twere a son. Perhaps he might one day be Lavrans of Jorengard, said the sick man with a smile. On the way down through Gudbrandsdal, too, the body was to be taken into certain churches overnight, and these were all remembered in Lavrans' testament, with money gifts and wax tapers. Kristin felt sick, but it was with sorrow and disquiet of soul, for she could not hide from herself. It hurt her the more, the longer she was at home. Such was her heart that it hurt her to see that, now her father was drawing nigh to death, 'twas his wife that was nearest to him of all. Always she had heard her parents' life together held up as a pattern of seemly and worthy wedlock in unity, troth, and loving kindness. But she had felt, though without thinking upon it, that none the less there was something that stood between them, an uncertain shadow, but it dulled the life in their house, though they lived together in peace and kindness. Now there was no shadow any more between her parents. They talked evenly and quietly together, mostly of the little things of every day, but Kristin felt that there was something new in their eyes and in the tone of their voices. She saw that her father missed his wife always when she was not by his side. When he had himself talked her over into going to seek a little rest, he would lie as if waiting somewhat restlessly. And when she came in, 'twas as though peace and gladness came with her to the sick man. One day she heard them speaking of their dead children, yet they looked happy together. When Sire Eirik came over and read to Lavrans, Ranfrid sat ever beside them, and then he would often take his wife's hand and lie playing with her fingers and turning the rings on them. Kristin knew that her father loved her not less than before, but she had not seen clearly before now that he loved her mother too, and she understood how unlike must be the man's love for his wife, who had lived with him a long life in evil days and good, to his love for the child, who had but shared his joys and taken to herself his inmost heart's tenderness. And she wept and prayed God and St. Olaf for help, for she remembered that tearful and tender farewell last autumn on the hills. But it could not be true that she wished now that that farewell had been the last. On the day that begins the summer half-year, Kristin bore her 6th son, and already the 5th day after, she was up and had gone across to the hall to sit with her father. Lavrans didn't like this. It had never been the use in his house for a lying-in woman to come into the open air before the day she went to be churched. At least, he said, she must never cross the courtyard except when the sun was in the heavens. Rahnfried was listening when he spoke of this. "I was thinking but now, husband," she said, "that from us, your womenkind, you have never had great obedience, but we have most often done as we ourselves would." "Didn't you know that before?" asked her husband, laughing. "'Tis not your brother Trond's fault, then. Don't you remember that he would rail at me always for being an old woman, because I let you women have the upper hand?" Sigrid Undset came over daily to the dying man. The old parish priest's sight was nearly gone, but the story of the creation in the Norse tongue and the Evangels and Psalter in Latin he read as plainly and flowingly as ever, for he knew the books so well. But Lavrans had gotten a great book some years before, down at Sarstadt, and he was most fain to be read to from it. But Sigrid Undset could not manage to read in it by reason of his bad eyes. So her father prayed Kristin to try if she could read it. And when she was grown a little used to the book, she found, sure enough, that she could read from it fairly and well, and it was a great joy to her that now there was something that she could do for her father. In this book were such things as debates between fear and courage, between faith and doubt, body and soul. There were, likewise, some sagas of holy men, and more than one account of men who, while yet alive, had been wrapped away in the spirit and had seen the pains of the place of torment, the tribulations of purgatory fire, and the bliss of the heavenly kingdom. Lavrans spoke much now of purgatory fire, which he looked soon to enter, but he was quite without fear. He hoped for great solace from his friends and the priest's intercessions, and trusted firmly that St. Olaf and St. Thomas would give him strength in this his last trial, as he had so often felt that they had strengthened him in this life. He had always heard that he that was firm in the faith would never for a single moment lose from before his eyes the bliss to which the soul was going through the scorching fires. Kristin believed that her father thought with gladness of what was coming, as of a trial of his manhood. She remembered dimly from her childhood that time when the king's sworn men from the Dale set out for the war against Duke Eirik. It seemed to her that now her father looked forward to his death as he had looked forward then to adventures and battles. One day she said to him she thought he had had so many trials in this life that 'twas like he would come off lightly from those of the life to come. Lavrans answered, it seemed not so to him now. He had been a rich man. He had been born of a noble house. Friends had he had, and good advancement in the world. My heaviest sorrows were that I never saw my mother's face, and that I lost my children. But soon these will be sorrows no longer. And so it is with other things that have weighed on me while I lived. They are no longer sorrows. Her mother was often with them while Kristin read. Strangers too, and Erland now was glad to sit and listen. All these folks had delight of the reading, but she herself was shaken and made hopeless by it. She thought on her own heart that knew so well what good and right were, and yet was ever intent on unrighteousness. And she feared for her little child, scarce dared sleep at night for fear it might die a heathen. She had 2 women ever to sit up and watch, and yet she was afraid to fall asleep herself. Her other children had all been baptized before they were 3 days old, but they had put off this one's christening, since it was a big, strong child, and they would fain name it after Lavrans. And in the Dale here folk held stiffly to the custom that children must not be named after living men. One day, when she sat by her father and had the child in her lap, he prayed her to unwrap its swaddling clothes, for as yet he had seen no more than the little lad's face. She did so, and laid the boy on her father's arm. Lavrans stroked the little rounded breast, and took one of the small, tightly clenched hands in his. "Strange it is, kinsman, that you are to bear my breastplate. Now would you fill no more room in it than a worm in a hollow nut, and this hand has a great way to grow before it can grasp my sword hilt round. When a man sees such things as this little knave, he well nigh comes to understand that God's will with us was not that we should bear arms. But not much greater shall you be, you little one, before you long to take them up. 'Tis but the fewest men born of women that bear so great love towards God that they will forswear the bearing of arms. I never had such love." He lay a little, looking at the babe. "You bear your children under a loving heart, my Kristin. The boy is great and fat, but you are pale and thin as a wand, and so, your mother says, it was with them all when you were delivered of them. Ramborg's daughter was little and thin," he said, laughing, "but Ramborg blooms like a rose." "Yet it seems to me strange that she would not suckle her child herself," said Kristin. "Simon would not have it either. He says he will not repay her for the gift by letting her wear herself away. Bear in mind Ramborg was not full 16 years old. She had scarce worn out her own childish footgear when she had this daughter, and never had she felt an hour's sickness before. 'Twas no marvel that her patience was short. You were a grown woman when you were wedded, my Kristin." Of a sudden Kristin fell into a wild weeping. She scarce knew herself what she wept for. But it was so true. She had loved her children from the first hour that she knew she bore them in her womb. She had loved them while they plagued her with unrest, weighed her down, and made her uncomely. She had loved their little faces from the first moment she saw them, and had loved them every hour as they grew and changed. But none had rightly loved them with her, and joyed with her in them. 'Twas not Erland's way. He was fond of them enough, but Narkvi he thought had come too early, and as each of the others came, he had ever thought him one too many. She dimly remembered what she had thought of the fruit of sin the first winter she was at Husaby. She knew that she had been forced to taste its bitterness, though in other wise than she had feared. Something had gone wrong between her and Erland in those first days, and 'twas like it could never be made straight again. "What is it now, Kristin?" asked her father quietly in a little while. She could not tell him all this, so she said, as soon as she could speak for weeping, "Should I not sorrow, father, when you lie here?" At length, when Lavrans pressed her, she spoke of her fear for the unchristened child. On this he gave orders straightway that the child should be brought to church the next holy day. He said he didn't believe that this would slay him before God's good time. "Besides, I have lain here long enough now," he said, laughing. "Sad work there is over our coming and our going, Kristin. In sickness are we born, and in sickness do we die. Everyone that doesn't die suddenly. To me, when I was young, the best death seemed to be slain on the battlefield. But a sinful man may well have need of the sickbed, though now I cannot feel that my soul is like to grow stronger through my lying here." So the boy was christened the next Sunday, and was given his mother's father's name. Kristin and Erland were much blamed for this in the countryside, though Lavrans Bjorgulfsson said to all who came to see him that 'twas done at his desire. He would not have a heathen in his house when death came to the door. Lavrans began now to grow fearful lest his death should fall in the midst of the spring sowing, thereby putting to great hardship the many folk who would be fain to honour his funeral by following in its train. But one morning, 14 days after the christening, Erland came to Kristin in the old weaving house where she had lain since the boy's birth. It was well on in the morning, past the dinner time, but she was still abed, for the boy had been restless. Erland was much moved. He said to her, quietly and lovingly, that she must get up now and come to her father. Lavrans had had some fearful heart spasms at daybreak, and since had lain long swooning. Sigrid Undset was with him now, and had just heard his confession. It was the 5th day after Hallvard's Mass. Rain was falling gently and steadily. When Kristin came out into the courtyard, there came to her on the soft breath of air from the south the smell of fields new ploughed and dressed. The countryside lay brown under the spring rain. The air was blue between the high mountains, and the mists drifted along halfway up the hillsides. A tinkling of little bells came from the thickets along the brimming grey river. The flocks of goats had been let loose and were nibbling at the blossoming twigs. 'Twas the weather that had ever rejoiced her father's heart, the end of winter and cold for folk and for cattle, the beasts all set free from narrow dark byres and scanty forage. She saw at once in her father's face that now death was very near. About his nostrils the skin was snow-white, his lips and the circles round his great eyes were bluish, the hair had fallen apart and lay in damp strands over the broad dewy forehead. But he was in his full senses now, and spoke clearly, though slowly, and in a weak voice. The housefolk went forward to his bed one by one, and Lavrans took each of them by the hand and thanked them for their service, bade them farewell, and prayed them to forgive him if he had ever wronged them in any way. He prayed them, too, to think of him with a prayer for his soul. Then he said farewell to his kindred. He bade his daughters bend down so that he might kiss them, and he called down the blessing of God and of all the saints upon them. Both wept bitterly, and young Ramborg threw herself into her sister's arms. Then, with arms twined round each other, Lavrans' 2 daughters went to their place at their father's bed-foot, the younger one still weeping on Kristin's breast. Erland's face quivered, and tears ran down over his cheeks when he lifted Lavrans' hand and kissed it, while he prayed his wife's father in a low voice to forgive him all his sins against him at all times. Lavrans said he did so with all his heart, and he prayed that God might be with him all his days. There was a strange pale light over Erland's comely face when he came softly round and stood at his wife's side, hand in hand with her. Simon Dar wept not, but he knelt down when he took his father-in-law's hand to kiss, and he stayed kneeling a little while, holding it fast. "Warm and good is your hand, son-in-law," said Lavrans with a faint smile. Ramborg turned to her husband when he came to her side, and Simon threw his arm about her slender, girlish shoulders. Last of all, Lavrans bade farewell to his wife. They whispered some words to each other that none could hear, and exchanged a kiss in the sight of all, as was fitting and seemly, since death was in the room. After this, Ranfrid kneeled down in front of her husband's couch, with her face turned towards his. She was white and calm and still. Sigrid Undset tarried on after he had anointed the dying man with the sacred oil and given him the viaticum. He sat by the bedhead, saying over prayers. Ranfrid was sitting now on the bed's edge. Some hours went by. Lavrans lay with half-shut eyes. Now and again he moved his head restlessly on the pillow, groped a little with his hands on the coverlid, and breathed heavily and moaningly once or twice. They thought that he had lost power of speech, but there were no death throes. It grew dusk early, and the priest lit a candle. The folk sat still, looking at the dying man and listening to the dripping and trickling of the rain outside the house. Then an unrest seemed to come upon the sick man. His body shook. A blue shade came upon his face, and he seemed to struggle for breath. Sir Eirik passed his arm behind his shoulders and lifted him up to a sitting posture while he stayed his head on his own breast and held the cross up before his face. Lavrans opened his eyes, fixed them on the crucifix in the priest's hand, and spoke softly, but so clearly that most in the room heard the words. Exsurrexi et ad hoc sum tecum. Once more some tremors passed over the body, and his hands groped on the coverlid. Sir Eirik went on holding him close for a little while. Then he gently laid his friend's body back on the pillows, kissed the forehead and smoothed the hair about it, before he pressed the eyelids and nostrils shut, then rose to his feet and began to pray. Kristin was given leave to take her turn in watching the body at night. They had laid out Lavrans on straw in the upper hall, for there was most room there, and they looked to have a great gathering of folk for the wake. Her father seemed to her unspeakably beautiful as he lay there in the taper's light, with his pale golden face bared. They had turned down the napkin from his face so that it might not be soiled by the hands of the many folk that came to see the corpse. Sir Eirik and the parish priest from Vam chanted over him. The Vam priest had come up in the evening to bid Lavrans a last farewell, but had been too late. But already the next day the guests began to come riding to the manor, and now it behoved Kristin, for seemliness' sake, to betake herself to bed again, since she had not yet been to church. Now it was her turn to have her bed decked out with silken coverings, and the finest cushions the house could furnish. The Giesling cradle was brought back from Formo on loan. Lavrans the younger was laid in it, and every day people came in and out to see her and the child. Her father's body kept fresh and sweet, she heard. It was but grown somewhat more yellow, and none had seen before so many candles brought to set about a dead man's bier. On the 5th day began the grave ale, and 'twas stately beyond measure in every way. There were more than 100 strange horses on the manor and at Laugabru, and besides some guests had to lie at Formo. On the 7th day the heirs divided the lands and goods in all friendliness and concord. Lavrans had taken order for all things himself before he died, and all followed his wishes faithfully. The next day the body, which lay now in the Olaf's church, was to be brought forth to begin the journey to Hamar. The evening before, rather 'twas far on in the night, Ranfrid came into the hearth-room house, where her daughter lay with her child. The mistress of the house was exceeding weary, but her face was clear and calm. She bade the serving women go out. "Every house on the place is full, but I think you will find a corner somewhere. I have a mind to watch over my daughter myself on this, my last night in my home." She took the child from Kristin's arms, bore it across to the hearth, and made it ready for the night. Strange it must be for you, mother, to flit away from this place where you have lived with my father all these years," said Kristin. "I scarce understand how you can bear it." "Much less could I bear it, I think," said Ranfrid, rocking little Lavrans in her lap, "to live here and not see your father going about among the houses. You have never heard how it came about that we flitted hither to the dale and made our home here," she began again in a while. "The time word came that they looked my father, Ivar, should soon breathe his last, I was unfit to take the road. Lavrans had to journey north alone. I remembered well, 'twas such fair weather the evening he set forth. Already in those days he had come to like riding late in the cool. So he was to ride to Oslo that night. 'Twas just before midsummer. I went with him to where the road from the manor cuts the church road. Do you remember? There are some great bare rocks there, and barren soil round about. The worst lands on all of Skog. They ever feel the drought first. But that year the corn grew well and fairly on those fields, and we spoke of it. Lavrans walked, leading his horse, and I had you by the hand. You were 4 winters old. When we came to where the roads joined, I told you to run home to the houses. You were unhappy to go, but then your father said that you should see if you could find 5 white stones and set them in a cross in the beck below the spring. 'Twas to guard him from the trolls of the Yorza Wood when he sailed by there. Then you set off running. "Is that a thing that folks there tell?" asked Kristin. "I have never heard of it, either before or since," said her mother. "Your father must have made it up, I think, there and then." "Do you remember? He made up so many tales when he played with you." "Yes, I remember." I went with him through the wood, all the way to the dwarf stone. Then he bade me turn back, and then he too went back with me to the crossroads again. He laughed and said I might have known he would not let me walk alone through the wood, and when the sun was gone down too. As we stood there at the crossroads, I put my arms around his neck. I was so cast down because I could not come back home. I never could thrive at Skog, and I longed ever to be back north in the Dale. Lavrans comforted me, and at last he said, "When I come back, if I find you with my son in your arms, then you may ask me for whatever you like, and if it is in the power of man to give it, you shall not have asked in vain." I answered, "I pray that we might flit up hither and dwell on the lands of my heritage." Your father liked this but little, and he said, "Could you not have found a better thing to pray for?" He laughed a little, and I thought, he will never do this. And it seemed to me but reason he should not. Afterward, you know how things went with me. Sigurd, your youngest brother, didn't live more than an hour. Halfdan christened him, and he died straight away. Your father came home one morning early. He had heard at Oslo the night before how things stood at home, and had ridden straight on without tarrying. I was still in bed. I was so sorrowful I had not the heart to rise. It seemed to me I would rather never had risen again. God forgive me. When they brought you into me, I turned my face to the wall and would not look on you, my little child. But then Lavrans said, as he sat by my bedside, with his cloak and sword still on, that now we must try whether things would go better for us if we lived here at Jorengard. And 'twas thus we came to make our flitting from Skog. But since it was so, you may think that I have no mind to dwell here, now Lavrans is gone." Ranfrid came over with the child and laid it to his mother's breast. She took the silk coverlid that had been spread over Kristin's bed in the daytime, folded it up, and laid it aside. Then she stood a while looking at her daughter, and touched the thick yellow-brown plait that lay between her white breasts. "Your father asked me so often if your hair were as thick and fair as ever. 'Twas a great joy to him that you didn't lose your loveliness through bearing so many children. He rejoiced much over you in these last years, that you had grown to be so notable a woman, and still stood fresh and fair with all your fair little sons about you. Kristin gulped down her tears once or twice. To me, Mother, he would often speak of how you had been the best of wives. He said I should tell you. She stopped abashed, and Ranfrid laughed softly. Lavrans might have known that he didn't need anyone to tell me of his loving kindness towards me. She stroked the child's head and her daughter's hand, which was round the little one. But maybe he would have. It is not so, my Kristin, that on any day I have envied you your father's love. 'Twas but right and reason that you have loved him more than me. You were so sweet and lovely a little maid. I was not grateful enough that God had let me keep you, but I ever thought more on what I had lost than on what I possessed. Ranfrid sat down on the bedside. They had other ways at Skog than our ways at home here. I cannot call to mind that my father ever kissed me. He kissed my mother when she was laid in the dead straw. Mother kissed Gudrun at Mass, for she stood nearest her, and then sister kissed me, but else we never used to kiss. At Skog there was a custom that when we came from church after having taken the sacrament, and we alighted from our horses in the courtyard, Sir Bjorgulf kissed his sons and me on the cheek, and we kissed his hands. Afterward, all married pairs kissed each other, and then we shook hands with all the serving folk that had been at the service, and wished each other all good of the sacred food. And it was much their use, Lavrans and Asmunds, to kiss their father's hand when he made them gifts and at such like times. When he or Inga came in, the sons arose always to their feet, and stood till they were bidden to sit down. At first these all seemed to me foolish, outlandish ways. Afterward, in the years I lived with your father, when we lost our sons, and through all those years when we suffered such great fear and sorrow for Ulfhild, it was well for me then that Lavrans had been nurtured so, to follow gentler and more loving ways. In a while Kristin said low, Father never saw Sigurd then? No, said Ranfrid in the same low tones. I saw him not either while he lived. Kristin lay silent a while. Then she said, None the less, Mother, it seems to me you have yet had much good in your life. Tears began to slide down over Ranfrid Ivarsdatter's white face. Tears began to stream down over Ranfrid Ivarsdatter's white face. Aye, God help me. To me, too, it seems so now. Soon after she took the babe, which was sleeping now, from its mother's breast, and laid it in the cradle. She fastened up Kristin's shift with his little brooch, stroked her daughter's cheek, and bade her sleep now. Kristin lifted a hand. Mother, she said beseechingly. Ranfrid bent down, drew her daughter close in her arms, and kissed her many times. She had not done this before in all the years since Ulfhild died. Next day 'twas the fairest spring weather, as Kristin stood behind the corner of the hall house and looked over at the hillsides beyond the river. The smell of growth was everywhere, and the song of becks set free. There was a tinge of green on all the woods and meadows. Where the road ran along the mountainside above Laugarbru, a patch of winter rye shone out fresh and bright. John had burnt the undergrowth there last year, and sowed rye in the burned plot. She would see the funeral train best when it passed by there. And there it was, moving slowly along below the hillside scree and above the fresh new rye field. She could make out all the priests riding ahead of all. There were acolytes too in the first troop, bearing crosses and tapers. She could not see the flames in the bright daylight, but she saw the tapers themselves as slender white streaks. Then came 2 horses bearing between them her father's coffin on a litter. And then she could pick out Erland on his black horse, her mother, Simon and Rambourg, and many of her kinsfolk and friends in the long funeral train. For a while she could clearly hear the priest's chant above the roar of the Lagan, but then the sound of the hymn died away, lost in the noise of the river and the humming of the becks on the hillsides. Kristin stood still, gazing, long after the last pack horse with baggage was lost from sight in the wayside woods.